Hey players, I'm here with David Newell. Now, David Newell is best known as playing Mr. McFeely on the TV show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Now, for those of you that know, Mr. Rogers was a huge inspiration on my life. He's affected everything I've done and I've put together my work, my book, my videos, everything. Now, I've had the pleasure of meeting David in person at the Pittsburgh Light Up Night Festival last year, and he is just a beaming light of energy and just so bright. And after all these years, I think that he brings so much joy and kindness to everyone that he meets and interacts with. Now, for those of you guys that know, the Mr. Rogers movie is coming out soon called A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. It's starring Tom Hanks. And in this interview, I just wanted to kind of learn more about David's life and experience, and also just his insights on working with Mr. Rogers, being on the show, and his thoughts on the new movie coming out. So, David, thank you so much for being here.
Speedy delivery, Josh. Before we do anything, I want to, maybe your viewers will recognize this. That is my Speedy delivery hat, one of the many I've had over the years, and I always keep one handy and try to start off an interview with it. But that's, in case your viewers don't know, that's what I wear on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and I say Speedy delivery a lot. I have, of course, a jacket and a mailbag and glasses and a mustache, and that's my character of Mr. McFeely.
Over the years, I've always loved the Mr. McFeely character. Watching the show, every time you came on in the episodes and stuff, it was always, what is he bringing? What's the delivery today? It was always such a good feeling.
Well, I'm going to take the hat off and be David Newell again, and I'll put that aside. And now I'm David Newell, who plays Mr. McFeely.
So one thing I'm curious about is just how you got started on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Well, that was, let me see, 1967 to be exact, September. I was in London the summer of 1967 visiting my cousin, who was in the Navy at the time. And I met a friend who was also there studying, and we traveled around Europe a little bit, but came back to London. And that's at the time where you picked up your messages. No, there was no internet, nothing except telegrams and telephones. So I had a telegram that I picked up at the London American Express office from a mutual friend of Fred Rogers and mine. I didn't know Fred, but I knew this person who knew both of us. And to make a long story short, he said, Fred Rogers has gotten underwriting for taking Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood from a local program in Pittsburgh to a national distribution. And my friend, his name was Bob McCulley, set up an appointment for me when I came back to Pittsburgh, and I met Fred, and here I am. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the interview. We talked for about an hour, and my job was to be in charge of all of the props, the costumes, production coordinator, basically. And we talked for an hour, and then he started to ask me questions about myself, and then out of the blue, he said, when can you start? Can you start next week? And I said, I sure can. And that was my interview. And then it's like Fred. He didn't ask, let me see your resume. What did you do in this year? What did you do for that company? He just talked to me about me. And that was his way of interviewing. That's who he was. He found out what he needed to know and hired me. Oh, yes. And just as I was ready to leave, I had my scripts that I had to locate props and so forth. And he said, oh, I want you to play this character of the delivery man on the program, too. And your lines are in the scripts I've just given you, and we'll start taping in about 2 weeks. And we'll have a production meeting next week. And that was that. I was hired, and that was, 52 years ago. And here I am. So that's in a nutshell sort of how I got into my delivery role on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, or that's my career in a nutshell for you.
The career-defining role, saying Speedy delivery.
Yes.
I mean, I think that that line, the whole Speedy delivery line, is something that's so iconic and so memorable for so many people. What age would you say you were, or how old were you when you kind of got involved in Mr. Rogers?
Let's see. I was probably in my mid-20s at the time. I had been working at a theater, and I was in college. And I was working in a theater, but I also worked at a theater in Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh Playhouse that people probably have heard of. It's quite well known within regional theaters. And they had a school. It was called the Pittsburgh Playhouse School of the Theater, and I went there for 2 years, and it was an intense training course in production, acting, directing, everything. And I did that for 2 years, then continued to work at the theater after my course was over. And then I went to Europe, and then comes the telegram. But my background goes way back, I think, to earlier times when I was about 11 or 10. I went as a child to the Saturday classes at the Pittsburgh Playhouse, acting classes. And my interest in theater and in film and television wasn't too popular at that point, just beginning, was I liked it all, and I liked behind the stage or in front of the camera. I liked, it wasn't that I always wanted just to be an actor or always wanted to be a director. I liked it all. And I remember, even at a very young age, loving movies and reading all I could about them through magazines and books at the time. My interest in theater came with my grandfather. And he took me to a touring company. That means it was a professional touring company that played Pittsburgh at a majestic old theater downtown Pittsburgh. It's no longer there, but it was a wonderful, beautiful old 1890 era theater. And this was probably in the early 50s. It was still standing. It isn't any longer. However, the name of the play was called Harvey. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's a famous classic play about a man who sees a 6 foot tall rabbit, and he can only see Harvey. He's the only person. And of course, people think he's eccentric, and they placated him. They went along with his, what they thought was a little delusional. But it was a very funny play, very warm play. If you ever get a chance to see it, Jimmy Stewart made a movie of it. And that was my first professional play that I saw as a kid. I was probably 8. And ever since then, I've been entranced with some form of theater, television, movie being theater, really. And I came home after that matinee. My grandfather dropped me off at our house, and I went to the basement and recreated the set and put curtains up, stick curtains. And I think that was the beginning of my interest in all of it. Then back to your other question about how did it all begin. Well, Fred hired me, and on the first day of taping, I was in my costume. I had everything all ready. The puppets were dressed, the scripts were in place, the props were in place, and I was on that first show that we taped, and I was in my costume. And I was waiting at the corner of the studio till we're ready to tape, and the phone rang. And it was the Sears Roebuck Foundation. They're the people who gave us money to underwrite the program. And they wanted to speak with Fred. So he went into the control room where there was a phone, and they were wishing us well, calling us, wishing us well. We love the concept. We love that you're going to make it a national program, etc. But there was one thing he said. He said, but don't call the delivery man Mr. McCurdy. Because that was the name of the person who was calling, the Sears Roebuck Foundation president who allocated the money to us. And I think he thought that was a little too self-serving to have Mr. McCurdy be the delivery man.
So Mr. McCurdy was the original character's name.
Yes, and the original scripts. Yeah, that was what never made it to air. But on my scripts, it said Mr. McCurdy, Mr. McCurdy. And then he called. Fred had a very nice phone conversation, came back in the studio, and I could see that he was thinking about something. He said, we have to get you a new name. He said, and then he explained. And before he finished the sentence, he said, McFeely, that's who you are now. You're Mr. McFeely, because his middle name, I don't know if you know that, is Fred McFeely Rogers. And McFeely is a family name, his mother's maiden name, and the real Mr. McFeely is his grandfather. So we started the first taping, and I delivered an armadillo, a South American, and it had something to do with the theme of the story. But I made the delivery, and we looked at it, camera angles. We talked about the animal a little bit, and I said, "Well, I have to get it back to the zoo now, Mr. Rogers. I just wanted to show you and your friends the armadillo," something like that. And as I left, I went to, instead of saying goodbye, I had on my jacket, which you probably remember, it says Speedy Delivery Patch. And I just happened to remember I had that. And I just said, "Well, Speedy Delivery, Mr. Rogers." And he said, "Speedy Delivery, Mr. McFeely." And the sort of the little catchphrase stuck. And it's almost a word like shalom. Shalom means hello, goodbye, we love you, whatever. And that's what I use Speedy Delivery for: good day, goodbye, hello, how are you, all of that. But I sort of ad-libbed Speedy Delivery based on what it said on my jacket. So that is how the catchphrase began. And I think I have said it over these many, many years, millions of times, I'm sure. But that's a little insight for you. That's how the Speedy Delivery came about.
That's awesome. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. It kind of just came on a whim to you.
Yes, it did. It really grew out of the situation. And then I used it all the time through the rest of the years. And even the floor crew started calling me Speedy instead of David. My real name is David. They say, "Hey, Speedy," or the other nickname they had for me was Mac. McFeely. They'd say, "Hey, Mac, speak up a little louder," or whatever. So it stuck with me all these many years. And here I am talking to you.
That's
52
amazing.
years later.
So over the years, I'm sure you've come across so many influential people that have been on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, musicians and artists, and just people that I think really share the same values of kindness and care and compassion over the years. And I'm curious, over the years, who have you met and interacted with that you felt has been an influence on your life, or that you feel is someone that really carries the values that you hold and that were the values of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood?
Well, the one guest that we had that really stands out based on what you just said was Margaret Hamilton. Do you know who that is?
Mm-hmm.
The Wicked Witch of the West. We had her on the program. And I had heard stories of people around that time telling me, adults telling me, "Boy, that movie was on again. They used to show it on network every year." And I watched it with my kids, and they were afraid, the same places I was afraid of the witch, and their flying monkeys. And I had nightmares. A lot of people would say, that's not everybody, but a lot of adults would say that really scared me. And I mentioned it to Fred. I said, maybe there's a program we could do about demystifying the scary part of scary images. And he said, "Well, if you can find Margaret Hamilton, I'll write the script." He wrote his own scripts, but he said, "I'll write the script about it. And if you can find it," and I did. I found her. She was touring in a musical called Little Night Music at the time. And I got a hold of her agent, and we got her on the program. But she came, and she was a lovely, lovely woman. And my wife was working at the program at the time. She wasn't my wife then, but Maggie, she said, "Call me Maggie." And she would take us out to dinner and have these wonderful conversations. And she seemed like an aunt. And every Sunday night she would call and check in with us. In fact, when our son was born, we have 3 children who are now all grown and in their 30s and early 40s. When our son was born, we called and told her, and she said, "Well, I'm going to fly to Pittsburgh." She lived in New York, for the afternoon just to see him. And I picked her up at the airport and brought her into our house, and she sat for a couple hours, and then I took her back to the airport. She had a wonderful, wonderful time visiting. It was like your aunt or your grandmother coming. It was I think the closest. And what I learned from her is that she was a real trooper. She was in a lot of movies as a character actor, but she was always present, always there to do her job. The discipline she had she had 1 child, and she was a single parent. She was divorced, I think, early on, but she had a career in theater and was able to also manage to be a mom too and raise her son. It was quite inspiring. that she also was able to make a living in this business, which is tough. Theater and television and movies is a tough business. It's consuming too. And she did. And that was inspirational to see that she could still be a wonderful actress, but also herself, and thinking about others too. She didn't have to do that, flying into Pittsburgh, but she wanted to. Oh, and in addition to that too, uh, when she came to our house, I pulled up in our driveway, and there was a kitchen door right there, and she got into the house, and if our neighbor called, and our neighbor said, "Did I just see the Wicked Witch of the West go into your kitchen?" She had seen she wasn't in her costume, but she was identifiable enough, and I said, "Yes, you did. She's here to see our new son, whose name is Taylor."
The real heroes and the real inspirational people are the ones that are the most human, that are living normal lives and still finding ways to be extraordinary by helping others, by making time for others. It's like, I think that's something that we overlook a lot. Just the simple nature of like being there for someone or reaching out to someone can make all the difference in their lives and affect them on such a deep level.
No, oh, you're absolutely right. And Fred Rogers did that through television. He was not an actor. He was a communicator and a teacher, but he really deeply cared about others. It wasn't an act. You couldn't do that for 50 some years. You couldn't keep that going. And Maggie, the Margaret Hamilton, was that way too. She was an actress and made her living doing commercials and acting, but at the same time, she was a very human person, very caring, and made a lot of friends wherever she went. But we became good friends. I'm sure she had thousands of other nephews and nieces, as she called them, over the years, but we managed to fit into the group, and it was wonderful. She passed away, I think, when she was about 80, in her mid 80s, maybe, and I think she had a touch of dementia uh, after a while. But she was a lovely, lovely person, and that is the one person I remember to when you asked that question. What person made an impression on you? But they all did. Everybody we had on the program were not on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood because they were famous. They were on because of something they did and their care. The other person who was just a wonderful person was Yo-Yo Ma. I mean, he is a wonderful person. He's the same way. He's a genius musician. But at the same time, when you meet him in person, he's very caring and takes the time to talk to you and meets everybody and remembers things about them. And that was a wonderful meeting when Fred met him on camera and Yo-Yo played a Brahms lullaby on his cello. It was a wonderful moment because both men were really communicators in two different ways, one through music and one through television. And to see that meeting was wonderful. But he was the other person that I would use to answer your question.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and I agree. I think that Yo-Yo Ma was, he was one of the most inspirational musicians in my opinion. And I think
Yes.
that having people like him on the program, I think also brought the attention of what he was doing and how he was affecting people to a basic medium like television, whereas most people and most children too at the time probably would have never heard of him. And television kind of was an equalizer for everyone of all backgrounds. So it
You're
allowed
right.
them access to these people that they would never see or interact with or hear anywhere else.
No, you're absolutely right. Fred brought all types of uh, um, occupations. Yo-Yo Ma, musician, famous and non-famous. It was what they did and what they loved that Fred was interested in communicating to his audience. You can tell that Yo-Yo Ma loved what he was doing. Oh, there's a saying, and you mentioned a little earlier about doing something you like when you have a job. And there's a saying that I'm sure you've heard is when you choose a career, make sure you choose something you love because you'll never work a day in your life. Have you heard that? Ever heard that? And that's what I feel. I think I chose something that I never worked a day in my life. Obviously I have, but I don't feel that I have. It's been something I love doing, and going to work was a pleasure, not a chore. And not everybody can say that. And I was blessed to be able to go to work looking forward to it, and knowing at the same time that I was a part of a bigger picture, and I was helping put together these programs that are messages in a way for young children to help families, and maybe help them with everyday life. And for instance, Fred did a program on going to school for the first time. Now that's a big step for a lot of children, leaving the comfort of a house, or your parents or your grandparents, whatever, and going to school. And we did a whole week on showing children what a school looks like, what the bus looks like, visiting the kindergarten, showing them the bathroom facilities. A lot of the young children are concerned about all of that. You wouldn't think that. And the program is not dramatic. Seems like a very dull program, but for that age group, it's a very important message for them. And I felt good about being able to be part of that, helping children grow.
I see the internet now and YouTube's, I guess, as the medium, as the place where younger people are accessing to learn things and to find information out. Now it's like the internet and watching videos is kind of the way that people educate themselves on things that they're curious about, or where they turn to if they have questions about things. And for myself, everything I try to bring to YouTube and all is helping teenagers as well, because I recognize that, the same way I think Fred recognized for children that they needed someone that can help show them that, yes, the world is scary, but there are people that love you and care about you and will help you through it and help you figure it out as you grow.
There's a point where children will watch Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It's designed for young children, preschoolers and early elementary. Then they drop out for a while because they're growing. It's developmental. And in a way that's healthy, because the program is designed for a younger child. And when they start to move away and watch other things or do other things, that's a progress in a way. But we've heard stories of teenagers who sometimes, or college kids, watch Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And I have my own sort of theory that they're sort of remembering those days of how comfortable it was being supported by Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And they're about to go out into this cruel world, so to speak. And I think watching Mr. Rogers may be comforting for them, and it sort of speaks to what you just said, that they're never too old to learn something from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and be supportive. When you think about it, what he's saying to children can apply to anybody about feeling good about yourself, or scary feelings and so forth. He's talking to the inner person, and through television, and that's very important because a lot of people don't do that. And the program is he calls the program Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood not necessarily a program, which it is, of course. He calls it a visit, a television visit, which is unusual. He doesn't see it as a program. He sees it as a visit, which you can see that it is. Things that he shows children that might be helpful, going to school for the first time, going to the doctor for the first time, things that we forget about that are very important to that age group. And that's what he deals with. We did a show the show with Margaret Hamilton, how scary images scare a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people, and it could be helpful to them. And that's why we had Margaret Hamilton talking about scary images. We went to the Universal Studios to show them making The Incredible Hulk. That program, do you remember Incredible Hulk? Which was scary. Our daughter, when she was 3, saw the program inadvertently on TV. She just turned on the TV and there it was, and she had nightmares. And so I mentioned again to Fred, I think, is there any way that we can show that this is pretend? It's their version of pretend. So we went to the Universal and show them preparing the set, showing Lou Ferrigno, the Hulk, getting into his green makeup, breaking it down and demystifying it. And the underlying theme to all of that was one of Fred's songs is, what do you do with the mad that you feel? And it dealt with angry feelings, and that you don't hit somebody or throw something across the room or whatever, do something destructive when you're angry. You deal with those angry feelings. And that's the message that Fred wanted to get across. So helpful, I think, uh, for young children to understand that it's good to be in control of your feelings. And those themes run through Mr. Rogers all the time. It just wasn't one theme on angry feelings. It was sprinkled throughout the entire series. And that's the way that Fred thought television should be used for children, at least a part of it. And that's what he was capable of doing, of dealing with the emotional development of a young child. And that's what's behind The Neighborhood, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, for you, what was it like working alongside Fred every single day for all those years?
I don't have, but I feel I have a degree in child development after all these years. Learning so much about children and how he would write a script so it would reflect that child development that he studied. He had a degree in music, a degree in child development and theology. And all of those disciplines he used on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And so just by being there and observing him and seeing the script developed and reading them so I could prepare for my role and also get things that I needed for the program was very, very educational, and things that I wouldn't have thought about. I learned by just working with him, as did the other members of the staff. I wasn't the only one who was there. The other people, the director and the people on the floor crew, all learned something from Fred. And he wasn't the kind of person that would stop and say, now we're doing this because. You would catch it from him in a way, by just observing. There is an expression: attitudes are caught, not taught. And when Fred was doing his study with young children, he was assigned to go to a daycare center for a week or maybe more than that to just observe children at play. And that daycare center had a parent or a friend or somebody come in each week and show what that person does for a living. There was a baker, there was a plumber, that type of thing. But one week, a artist came in, a sculptor. And he came in with a big chunk of clay and put it right in the center of the table around which all the children were sitting, and just started to make something, encourage children to take a chunk. Didn't say, now do this, do that. Let them just have a piece of clay. And from that came a lot of wonderful art projects for the rest of that semester that those children produced, by observing that man loving what he was doing. And there's this saying, too, if you love to do something in front of children, they'll catch your enthusiasm. And that's what I think Fred did through television. He loved what he was doing. He felt he had a responsibility and a calling and a mission, but he still loved creating programs for children. And I think viewers, you yourself, caught some of that just by viewing. And it goes back to, again, the saying, attitudes are caught, not taught. He wasn't teaching. He said, now do this, do that, do this. He was doing something he loved in front of his audience. And that's what that sculptor was doing, too.
It's so important, I think, for everyone, for parents, for anyone, I think, that is in a place where someone can observe them, to live in such a way where it's like how you carry yourself is just, it's going to resonate with the world around you and resonate with the people around you, and the children especially.
And Fred realized that. And through his child development classes, he knew that. So his programs were designed with that in mind. It wasn't just open the cameras and let's do a show. All of his scripts were well thought through. In fact, he had an advisor that he met with once a week. Her name was Dr. Margaret McFarland, and she was an expert on children's play. And she taught these courses. It was the head of the department at University of Pittsburgh about child development. And Fred worked with her doing his uh, master's degree. He had already had his undergrad in music, so then he worked with children. Then he, at the concurrent with working with Margaret McFarland, he was going to theology seminary, and all of that he used in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Very unique uh, mission, I think, but so needed. And oh, for your viewers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is still on in many different ways. It's on a PBS Kids streaming channel. Amazon.com has it, so you can still see it. And what's happening, I don't know if you're familiar with Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood that's on PBS. A lot of kids are watching that first, and then their parents say, when I was growing up, and they explain about Mr. Rogers, and let me show you that. And we're getting another wave of people watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So it makes me feel very good.
I've always been a fan of Mr. Rogers, so I think it's amazing how the message, everything is kind of coming back now, especially with the new movie that's coming out with Tom Hanks. I'm curious, I don't know if you've seen it yet, but what are your thoughts on the representation and how do you think people are going to kind of interpret the movie and carry the values from it going forward?
That's an interesting question. It's hard to answer, but yes, I have seen the movie. I saw it 2 days ago for the first time, although I'd seen a lot of it being filmed, but it was out of context, and so you can't really tell until it's put together. And it's not a biography. It's a story of an author who came to do an article with Mr. Rogers from Esquire magazine, and how that changed the author's life, meeting Fred. And that's what the movie's about. It takes place probably within a month's time, or maybe over a period of time, not a long time. And you see this author who came very begrudgingly and sort of didn't want to do it. In fact, didn't want to do it. And his editor said, "You've got to do it. It's about an issue about heroes, and we want to include Mr. Rogers in it." And he came, and it turned his life around according and it's a true story. It's based on a true story. It's not a fictional story. And I thought the movie was absorbing just to watch that progress of the character's name is Lloyd in the movie, of Lloyd coming to meet Fred and interview him. And in a way, almost hostile to Fred at first. Not hostile in a mean way, but just want to get the story done. Just tell me this, just tell me that. And slowly, Fred found out about what may be bothering him, what was upsetting him, based on just being with him and helping him. That's what the movie's about, and I think it's an interesting character study. So don't go expecting to see, well, then I did this, then I did that. It's not that story. But McFeely's in it. There's an actor who plays McFeely, and there's a scene when they're taping a program, and Mr. McFeely makes a delivery to Mr. Rogers, who's Tom Hanks. And you mentioned Tom Hanks, and I think he was the perfect actor to play the role. He's must be in his early 60s now, so he's close to Fred's age. Well, at the time that the movie was made, or the incident occurred when this author came, they were about the same age. And it's so, I saw it, and it's hard to describe, at least for me, because I lived through it all. I remember some of the scenes that they were recreating. I remember the arrival of the author. In fact, I got the first phone call from the author because at that time I was doing public relations. All the years that we taped, I was always McFeely. But my job behind the scene changed. Ultimately, I became in charge of all the public relations for the program, and I would field requests for Fred, and I'd go out myself and do things. And the phone rang one day, and it was Tom Janot, was the real writer's name. In the movie, they changed it to Lloyd. And he said, I've been assigned to do an article on Fred Rogers for Esquire magazine. When can I talk to him? And I said, well, he's in New York now. You'd have to. Well, that's where I am. I'm in New York right now. And to make a long story short, I set up the first interview for Fred. And I think maybe we had some reservations because he was an investigative journalist assigned to do more of what he thought was more of a puff piece. This is all in the movie. I'm just relaying what's coming out of the movie. And he came with that attitude, I think, at least in the movie. It's a little more intensified in the movie for dramatic purposes, I think. But it's an interesting progress to see Fred, being Fred, having an interview, a discussion with the interviewer, and how slowly through the movie Fred is making an impact on this person's life. And that's the movie. And it's excellent. I recommend all your viewers to see it. And if they look closely, they can see me in a cameo. There's a restaurant scene that we're in. Some of these staff members are at a table close by Tom Hanks's table. And when you see the movie, look or listen for the line that Tom Hanks says. I'm paraphrasing, but something like, remember the people who inspired you as you were growing up. That is sort of the gist of the line. And at that point, before we started shooting, the director said, when Tom Hanks says that line, all of you at the tables here, just stop eating and think of the people who helped you as you were coming through life. And that's the scene I'm in, and the camera pans, and I can see myself. So there's amazing. A little cameo, a little extra cameo that I'm in. And then I'm represented by the actor playing McFeely too.
That's awesome. That's really cool.
Don't go expecting a biography. Go expecting an intimate conversation between two people, and how two people can, through conversation and understanding and compassion, learn from each other. I think Fred learned a lot from the interviewer too. It wasn't just the interviewer benefiting from Fred's compassion. Fred was learning something too. A lot of people have a tendency when the credits start rolling to leave. I wait to the very last credit.
I'm the same way.
I don't like people getting up. When you think of it, all of the hard work people do on every movie to make this movie, their names need to be seen. Of course, I'm being in the business, I'm a little more sensitive to that. But I think people should stay till the credits are over. Because you know what it does? It shows how much work goes into making a movie like this. It also has music that is still playing that really is still part of the impression of the movie, still part of the what the director was thinking. That music still relates back to what they just saw. So all of that is important, I think.
I agree with that too. I think that once the movie finishes and the credits are rolling and there is, like you said, the music, I think that, to me, that's always the time to kind of reflect on what I just watched. Like,
exactly.
You're there still processing everything you just experienced. And it's like a lot of people want to rush out and go to the next thing. But it's like sometimes it's good to take that 5-10 minutes, however long the credits are, to just kind of really think about that experience that you just had. I talk a lot about, everyone having what it takes to be somebody great. And I think for all of us, we define that in our own way. And I'm curious for you, what does it mean to be somebody great in this world?
I have a great opportunity, and something that I'm working on is something that I consider is great. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is a great contribution to everyone's lives. And I feel privileged to have been working on it. And again, as I said earlier, to be able to be part of something that is doing something more than trying to sell cornflakes or something to children. We're trying to take this medium, television, that is so pervasive and can do so much for everybody, and to use it to help and to create stories and to support families with young children. And I feel that's a great mission that Fred has, and I feel honored to be part of that great mission. So I'm just a spoke in the wheel, and Fred's the hub. There are a lot of spokes going out of the director and the cast and the other people who help produce the program. And I feel that my spoke is as important as the next spoke, and we're all helping the wheel move, and Fred being the hub. That's sort of a corny symbol, but I thought it made sense.
I think it makes sense too.
Fred Rogers always called the space between the TV screen and the person looking at the television. He called that space holy ground. And that ground, and producers of children's television and television in general have a responsibility to fill that ground with supportive, good information. And that's how Fred saw his mission. That was holy ground, and I have a responsibility to the viewers, and that came through. I think, although they couldn't articulate it, I think children could see that Fred Rogers, through the television screen, into that holy ground, that he had a respect for who they are and a respect for childhood. And that is that's hard to do, I think. But he managed to use television in that way. And again, going back to the word you use, great, that's a great accomplishment. And when you think about it, it's not an easy thing to do, but it's also Fred's genius of being able to be that communicator who can do all of that. He worked magic on television. The camera loved him, and audiences zeroed in because I think they were looking at a person who respected them. I think I chose a career that I really love, and I do. And again, I've never worked a day in my life by working with Fred Rogers. I've been associated with the program and the company now for 52 years, starting in 1967 when we first began to tape. And it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience. Going back to the word you used, it's been a great experience. And here I am talking to you. I wouldn't have thought in 1967, 68, the first season, that I would be here in whatever year we're in now, 2019, talking to you, who wasn't even born when we first started the program. You grew into it, as did many, many other children. And I can see how our work helped you. You wouldn't be sitting there, I don't think, if in some way the neighborhood and its message didn't help you become who you are. But before we close, I'm going to count to 3, and we're both going to say Speedy Delivery. So Sounds here we go. 1, 2, 3.
Speedy Delivery. Thank you so much.
See you, John.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye.